Okay, so hello everyone. So this is episode 3 of A Conversation with Cometan. You can find this on my YouTube channel and all the other social media channels that I do. I'm here today with Jeffrey Kotyk,
hmm
and we're going to be talking mainly about astrology. So this is going to be something a little bit different than what we've been speaking about before. We've had David Warner Matheson on the show the last 2 times, talking about ancient Egypt, astronomical religions in the ancient world, and sort of the influence of constellations on belief and things like that. But today we're going to be focusing on astrology, which is an area that I myself haven't looked too deeply into, but it's something that I intend to do more of in the future. So this will be a really interesting one for me. So, Jeffrey, if you want to just introduce yourself, I suppose.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. So, my background is basically in East Asian studies, in particular sinology, the study of medieval China, but I also look at Japan and India, and in recent years, also looking at Iran.
Yeah.
And I have my PhD from Leiden University in the Netherlands, my master's degree from Komazawa University in Japan, and then I did my undergraduate degree in Canada. I'm originally Canadian, but I spent the better part of my adult life so far outside of Canada, although I'm in Canada right now. And my background beyond that is primarily looking at the intersection and the relationship between astrology and East Asian religions.
Yes.
And what I've found in my research is that astrology, or more specifically horoscopy, the casting of horoscopes, was transmitted to medieval China starting in the 8th century Common Era from Indian and Iranian sources. And then it became very, very popular in China. And subsequently, it was transmitted to Korea and then later Japan, where it was also quite influential. And we see it in the historical literature as well as in the religious traditions.
Brilliant. So just to tell you a bit about my background as well, I'm not sure how much you've read about me, but I've just finished my master's degree here in the UK. I was doing it on prehistoric astronomical religion and sort of the interactions
hmm
between astronomy and religious belief in and also looking at sort of the origins of religion, really, and looking at the influence of astronomy in the origins of religion and coming at it from a purely astronomical perspective. So what I was looking at was sort of cave art and trying to suggest that there is a distinct religious tradition that has continued to the present day, that has origin, that is based on astronomy and astronomical observation and things like that, that has origins all the way back in sort of the Paleolithic period of the Stone Age, Upper Paleolithic period. So that's where my background is on this sort of area. I'm also founder of Astronism as well, which is probably what you've read a little bit about that, perhaps.
hmm
And so what I see that is sort of like a modern manifestation of this sort of long tradition, this very old tradition of religion. It's sort of got new ideas, new practices, new approaches to similar topics that all religions consider, but it's always from sort of an astronomical perspective, you could say that. And so now I've moved into doing my PhD. I'm sort of very different from you, actually, because I've done all my study at the same university.
mm
I did my bachelor's at the same university and my master's and now my PhD. Various reasons for that, but I've just started my PhD and I've moved into freedom of religion. So I've gone into a totally different area, but I always keep my eye on this sort of topic of sort of astronomy and religion and the interactions, because it's very important to me and my own
hmm
personal beliefs. And what I kind of just wanted to start off with was based off of what I began to research, was this astronic tradition, which is what I described it as, that there's a tradition of religion here, there's a tradition of philosophy as well, that there's sort of is based on astronomical observation. And I really did see and do continue to see astrology as a huge aspect of that. Obviously, that is still, my theory is still probably not accepted by most people, but I do see astrology as part of that. And I see sort of astrology as maybe like a cousin to what I'm doing with Astronism. Because of course, astrology and the issues that it addresses do intercede with religion, don't they? And they do intercede with some of the same questions and that religion has attempted to answer. Perhaps why some other religions began to not like astrology later on. So
well, it's a point that I've brought up before in my research, that I think astrology should be treated as religion.
right, okay, that's interesting.
And the reason for that is that if we go back to the early sources in Mesopotamia, what you see is an association between the planets and the native deities.
Yes.
So Marduk was associated with what we call Jupiter, and Ishtar was associated with Venus.
Yes.
And then that tradition was carried over into Egypt, the Greek world, and the Roman world. And hence we still refer to the planets using their Latin divine names, Jupiter, Mercury, etc.
Yes.
So there was immediately an association between the planets, which were increasingly systematically understood in Mesopotamia, and their divinities. And then over time, that association became very commonplace across much of Eurasia. The Indians also assigned divine names to the planets. They have Navagraha, the 9 planets, which includes the 7 visible planets, plus Rahu and Ketu. Rahu is the ascending node of the moon, and Ketu is comets. And then later it was assigned the function of the descending node of the moon. And then this pantheon of planetary deities was also carried over to China. China originally didn't view the planets as divine entities. It viewed them as essences of the 5 elements or 5 phases. So the wood star, for example, is Jupiter. The fire star is Mars. But with the advent of these foreign religious traditions, particularly Buddhism introducing this astral pantheon, they started viewing the planets in anthropomorphic and also zoomorphic forms as divine deities, intelligences with which you could communicate and negotiate your own personal fate based on your horoscope chart, and also just the tides of time. And so that was also an important part of astrology, is electional astrology, which is determining the most auspicious time to carry out an activity, but also determining inauspicious times in order to avoid calamities. So it's not entirely deterministic. You can determine the future also based on your decisions as well. So in that sense, astrology from the ancient period ought to be considered religion, because in large part it's based upon non-falsifiable premises. So in scientific thinking, of course, in order to make a scientific truth claim, it has to be falsifiable, such as the claim that all swans are white. But because you can prove that wrong, you can point to black swans. But something like predicting somebody's future based on their horoscope chart, people do make those predictions, and sometimes it's accurate, but it's more of an intuitive truth claim, I think, than being falsifiable in the absolutely scientific sense. So in modern terminology, it's probably better to consider astrology as religion. However, historically in the West, this hasn't really been accepted, because if you look at the history of astrology in the West, it's primarily based upon the work of Claudius Ptolemy. Claudius Ptolemy was a 2nd century astrologer and astronomer who worked out of Alexandria in Egypt. He was Greco-Egyptian. And if you read the Tetrabiblos, you can see that it's very different from how other Hellenistic astrologers wrote. Other Hellenistic astrologers viewed the planets as deities, and they viewed the movements of the planets and the stars as a way of sort of signaling fate. And the skilled astrologer could interpret somebody's fate, and they could predict the future on the basis of this. However, Ptolemy was a materialist, and he saw the planets as purely physical, insentient, that is to say, non-conscious elements, and their influences in terms of heat and coolness and so forth, moisture, affected the development of people and nations and animals and plants on Earth. And so his theory became mainstream, but only after antiquity. And I think it was also appealing to monotheist religions because they didn't want to take on also the polytheist pantheon into their monotheist framework.
Yeah.
In many cases, they indirectly did. So if you look at Christian era astrological texts, they often portray the planets in anthropomorphic forms. But there's still this sort of hesitation about attributing them any sort of intelligence, because then you start getting into idolatry or polytheism. Whereas in India and East Asia, and also in Sasanian Iran, pre-Islamic Iran, which was from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, they didn't have such qualms with accepting planets as deities. So in that sense, if you look at classical astrology, but also if you look at non-monotheistic astrology in South Asia and East Asia, you can see that it's very polytheist in its orientation. And so the planets were considered divinities. And on top of that, you have the tradition of astral magic, which stretches also back to antiquity. So if you look at the Greco-Egyptian papyri, the magical papyri, some of them offer prescriptions on how to deal with these deities. So you burn specific incense and you make incantations to the planets in order to ward off sort of negative influences. And later magicians built upon that tradition, not just in the Near East, but also in India and also East Asia. And they came up with all sorts of ritual frameworks with which you could effectively negotiate your fate. And so in that sense, I would treat astrology and astral magic as religion, but most religious studies departments in universities would not accept that at present, because the theologians often will conceive of astrology as a heresy.
Yes.
And because it's rejected by their canon, but then the science department doesn't want to deal with it either because they consider it pseudoscience.
Yes, and it seems as though, and that's sort of what I came across, was that astrology seems to have fallen between the gap, doesn't it, between religion and science, and so
yeah, it exists on the fringes. Even today, the academic study of it, the scholarly academic scientific study of historical astrology is not accepted by any mainstream field.
Wow. Yeah. So it's and I suppose because obviously it's at one time in the West it was treated with the highest regard, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was sort of, on the same level as what maybe astronomy itself would be today, isn't it? On that type of level. So to sort of fall from its grace in a way in the last couple hundred years, it's kind of sad, I suppose. But what I kind of wanted to bring to that was try and give it a bit of a home in a way, and sort of that's kind of what I want my theory to be, is to give astrology more of a home within a religious tradition that is alongside other, like star worship, for example,
Mhm.
and along other lines as well. And so I think, to me, that makes sense that it fits within that sort of like an astronic tradition, which is what I call it. And I think maybe, hopefully, the more that I get that theory out there, the more it might be accepted by religious studies departments, because it allows them to place it in something. I don't know. We'll have to see about that, but it is encouraging to hear you say that, because that was one of my first questions, was what do you consider it to be? Because it also, as well, obviously, it is a divination system as well. That's another sort of designation for it, isn't it? And do you see that as accurate, or is that's mainly what it's referred to as, isn't it? A system of divination. So what do you think of that sort of designation for it?
I think it also comes back to the definition of falsifiable versus non-falsifiable. And so divination, you could argue that divination does make falsifiable truth claims, but most traditions of divination tend to be more ambiguous and intuitive in its truth claims. So if you're practicing I Ching divination, the Chinese traditional divination with the yarrow stalks, if you read the interpretations of each of the hexagrams, it's ambiguous enough that you can apply it to various circumstances.
Yes.
That being said, astrology as a form of divination, people do make truth claims about it as well. They'll say, for example, you will come down with a certain illness at this age in your life. And sometimes that in fact does come true. Then in most cases, though, it tends to be more of intuitive truth claims.
Yes.
So such as, you know, you'll have this sort of personality, you'll have these sort of experiences throughout life, but it's not so strictly defined. But again, if you read especially the classical astrological literature, they'll say that people with this sort of configuration in their birth chart are prone to get torn apart by dogs, and that will be their death. So that's a pretty forward truth claim. But that being said, the modern definition of science versus religion too can also be very nebulous, and I think it's also very Eurocentric.
Yes.
So the separation of church and state, the separation of philosophy from religion. I mean, philosophy and religion in pre-modern Europe were more or less in the same sort of domain.
Yeah.
And then philosophy has also detached itself increasingly from science over the last 2 centuries. And this is in large part because philosophy also explores alternative metaphysical systems that aren't accepted by materialist science.
Yeah.
And our current modern science is based on materialism, and specifically also logical positivism. Whereas you can have alternative perspectives that could allow for example, the validity of astrology, such as panpsychism. So panpsychism is the position that all matter is conscious in various degrees. So, and the opposing position is that of emergentism, that consciousness arises only from certain configurations of matter at certain points in time. But then that also leads to a sort of question of reductionism, is at what point does consciousness arise? Why does it have to only be in certain configurations? So if you were to, in theory, take on a panpsychist perspective of the cosmos, even though we know that the planets are physical bodies orbiting around the sun, well, from a panpsychist point of view, but also from a polytheist point of view, there's actually no problem with assigning divinity to such a physical presence. Just as like in past times and also present times, people believe that mountains and rivers are gods and goddesses. So for example, in India, Yamuna is the name of a river, but it's also the name of a river goddess. Wow. So there's inherently nothing wrong from a polytheist point of view of assigning divinity to a physical presence, so a physical location.
Yeah.
And if panpsychism is true, that all matter has consciousness in varying degrees, then what about inorganic self-organizing systems like crystals and the sun? So that's also an intriguing position to also explore as well. Is like, so if all matter is conscious, then what about these self-organizing systems like the sun?
Yeah.
Is the sun conscious? And you know, there is philosophers today who have proposed that. So all these questions, things we have to consider outside of the framework of mainstream thinking.
Definitely. And what just sort of came to my mind then was when we were talking about that was sort of still the widespread sort of popular belief in astrology is still fairly widespread. I mean, there have been a few surveys on belief in astrology or some degree of belief in astrological aspects. And you know, it's still fairly widespread, isn't it, really? You might have more up-to-date figures on that. I mean, specifically in the West.
I think more people passively believe in astrology than disavow it.
Yeah.
That's one of the interesting points of this supposed enlightenment and rationalism of the modern day.
Yeah.
Is that you don't actually have to look very far to find people who are so-called enchanted. So people who believe in ghosts, in astrology, in the paranormal. In fact, if you do a survey of the population, what you find is that more often than not, more people believe in astrology and ghosts and fate than those who actively disavow it. Yeah. And I think to some extent too, you could even argue that there's a sort of element of class involved in this as well. So the people who write the sort of books that establish orthodoxy and orthodox thought in our education system and in the media tend to come from the middle to upper classes. and they don't necessarily incorporate the thoughts, feelings, inclinations of the working and the lower classes. And so this is, I think, a reflection of a wider bias in our mainstream media and publishing and education systems. So if you were to actually, for example, teach what do people actually believe in a high school classroom, and if you were to honestly just teach what people believe, there would be a lot of commotion over this, because you would find that a lot of people, their parents, their children, their relatives, do believe in ghosts, or maybe it's not even, they don't necessarily have a position that they've actively thought out and they can write down for you. But if you just ask them, it's like, do you believe in ghosts? It's interesting because in Japan, my colleagues and I, we go to the pubs. And we would ask the staff members, very simple in Japanese, do you believe that ghosts exist? And 9 times out of 10, they would say definitely. And they'd say, and sometimes they would comment that they had seen ghosts or perceived ghosts. But on the other hand, if you were to take a survey, I think, of the religious studies academics across the world, I would probably say more than half of them would respond, no, I don't believe in ghosts. It's because you have to take, well, you don't have to, but the orthodox position of the scientific academy is that of materialism. So you can't actually openly express those sort of opinions or sentiments.
And 2 other things I've just thought of then as well was that obviously sometimes people who aren't as academically or scholarly involved in the study of religion and these particular subjects, they may likely not realize that their belief in one thing sort of contradicts their belief in other things. So maybe they wouldn't realize that, not to sort of make them seem lesser, but maybe they wouldn't realize that ghosts and the beliefs in ghosts wouldn't mesh well with other beliefs like Buddhism maybe, or whatever other beliefs that they have. So that's an interesting point as well. But also one other thing was that I don't particularly myself like to sort of lump astrology into sort of like the new age, because I think like that has happened, and I don't personally, I don't really agree with that. I think that it is something totally separate, and this then comes back to my theory of the Astronic tradition. I think it should be in its own tradition based on its theme of the stars, and that's just what my position is. But I wanted to get your opinion on that. Do you think it does definitely belong in sort of that sort of new age or neo-pagan type category, forced into that by these theologians at the top who want to place it somewhere, but they're not really sure what to put it, so they'll put it in there? Is that what's happening?
Well, I think if you look outside the academy, the reason that astrology has been lumped in together with New Age beliefs is in large part because anything that was rejected by orthodoxy in mainstream or academic government policy inevitably got lumped together. And so if you look at the 19th century, there was not so much New Age, there was not so much a New Age movement, but there was still the occult. And astrology was associated with the occult, understandably so. And then you had other thinkers such as Aleister Crowley and other occultists who also wrote about astrology. But then in the 20th century, you had the decline and the demise of 19th century occultism. And then with the revivalism of astrology starting particularly after World War II, it never disappeared in the Western world, but it does have its ebbs and flows. And then it became increasingly popular in the late 20th century. And one thing that really allowed astrology to take off was computers. The fact that you could produce birth charts or horoscopic charts instantly without having to do all the calculations, because it's a very complex process. And it's easy to make mistakes if you're writing charts by hand. Now everybody can bring up a chart in just a few minutes, few seconds, really, if you have the software. And so what I see increasingly now is that astrology, also because it's very alive on social media, is dividing itself away from the New Age. And it's basically a field, it's a movement, it's a cultural force unto itself. And so in the late 20th century, it was associated with the New Age. And that was also, I think, because publishing. If you wanted to get a book on astrology, you probably had to go to a New Age bookshop.
Yes, okay. And it was just,
And it
yeah.
was just the publishing industry. It was New Age publishers who would publish books on astrology. Now they're self-publishing. There's astrologers who self-publish. There's companies that publish books in the realm of astrology.
Mm.
And also it was also, I think, also in the 1990s too, the astrology was also connected to the neo-pagan movement as well. But I see astrology as separating itself from that. But interestingly, with the rise of astral magic,
Yeah.
starting in the 2000s,
Mm.
and astral magic, I should define, is largely the production of talismans based on various works. In particular, the most popular works are those available in the English-speaking world. Those available in English include the Picatrix,
Okay.
and also Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. And there's also other texts as well, and more works are being translated and studied at the moment. But these are works that are from the medieval period and the early Renaissance that teach the practitioner how to produce talismans. And talismans are objects with inscriptions on them that are produced and suffumigated at a specific point in time that is established via a proper election. And suffumigation means to smoke something.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, for example, produce a talisman to Saturn, you have to find an optimal time when Saturn is in a good position. So he's not retrograde and he's not suffering any sort of afflictions. It's all sort of astrological vocabulary. So it's a very specialized science in order to determine proper elections to produce a talisman. And you also have to gather the right ingredients to burn when you are suffumigating it at a specific time. And you also have to make the inscription on the talisman at the prescribed time as well. And so now when we look at astrology, we can also see that there's a parallel tradition emerging, and it's quite rapidly emerging too, that deals with talismans, the production of talismans. But also by extension, you can use that sort of philosophy and also do simpler practices such as prayers. And I know a lot of astrologers now are increasingly incorporating prayer and icon worship into their practice as well. So they might not be producing talismans, which is a very long process, but they could easily just set up an altar, for example, to Venus, to Jupiter, and to make offerings at the proper time. And that's not so anomalous, because historically, that's what also people did in antiquity as well. So we have the days of the week. Saturday is Saturn's day, Sunday is the Sunday. And we also have the planetary hours. So 24 hours of the day, each of them is governed by a specific planet. And it's easy enough to follow that schedule. And so some astrologers I know also have altars to the planets. And so if they're feeling a particular influence that they want to avoid or they want to enhance in their lives, then they will make offerings to the planet in question and practice a sort of devotionalism toward that planetary deity.
It's absolutely fascinating. It really is. And it's just bringing so many more questions to mind. I suppose what you could call sort of the area that I'm most interested in is sort of meta-astrology. So it's sort of trying to define what astrology is, but also its purpose, more of the structural elements of it. That I think for me is really key to my research that I want to conduct into astrology, and trying to come to some conclusions about it, I suppose. But
have you looked at the work of Rupert Sheldrake? I remember just earlier I was saying that some philosophers say that the sun is conscious, and it's Rupert Sheldrake who's the one who's proposed that.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, his work is very interesting, and he was the one who proposed that the sun could be conscious because self-organizing systems, such as the sun and crystals and so forth, display features that consciousness also possesses. And he also points out that if you ask children to draw the sun, more often than not, they draw a face on the sun. So they attribute consciousness to the sun.
Yes, definitely.
So Rupert Sheldrake, we should definitely look at his work as well. And he's talked about this.
Definitely. I probably would need to talk to you again at some point, because this is not going to be enough just to cover everything that I've got today. But sort of the way I envisioned this going was that we're going to talk about, I wanted to focus on China just a little bit later on, but before we do that, what I want to come back to is sort of the idea that astrology is a religion, or should be designated as such. That in and of itself brings about a group of questions that means that it should be considered within comparative religion, and therefore must be studied in the same way that other religions are. Obviously, there is no central figure of astrology, is there? It's a very sort of dispersed, if we were going to look at it in this way, it's a very dispersed religion, therefore. I don't know, and then you've got a sort of these different companies, and are they charities? I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many other things that are going on there, but do you see, if astrology does sort of attain some sort of religion status within the public sphere or academic sphere, do you see it sort of morphing into a more organized, more centralized element or thing, or do you think that would sort of ruin the elements of it, ruin the nature of it, I suppose? Maybe.
Well, what would happen is if you started having official recognition of astrology as religion, you'd have to have intellectuals sit down and define what exactly they believe.
Yes.
And also to create a orthodoxy.
Yes.
Would inevitably lead to a class, a caste, or a profession of people whose job it is to act as clerics.
Yes.
And to define and to discuss what is orthodoxy and what is heretical.
Yes.
And also to kind of create a doxography of literature, so a canon of texts.
Yes.
Whereas what you see right now, in large part due to social media and the internet, is that astrologers can operate with great freedom, and they can interpret astrological phenomena according to their understanding of the art. And you have different sort of camps within astrology, modern astrology as well, specifically, and I'm speaking about the English speaking world. I should clarify that elsewhere in the world, for example, in Germany and Italy, you have very strong astrological communities, but they don't necessarily communicate to one another.
Right.
So there's a massive astrology community in the German speaking world, but only a few of them communicate regularly with those in the English speaking world. And most people in the English speaking world, unfortunately, don't communicate in German. So there's a sort of language barrier there. I also have colleagues in Japan as well who practice astrology. But going back to the English speaking world, what I've noticed though is that there is a great amount of freedom, and people can also belong to certain camps. So there's people who say they are Jyotish, which means that they're studying Indian astrology. So they use the sidereal zodiac and the nakshatras, the lunar mansions, and they interpret things based on Indian texts primarily. And then there's another camp of people who do Hellenistic astrology. So they interpret things using the 7 visible planets, excluding the outer planets, which were not known at the time. And then using texts such as the Tetrabiblos by Claudius Ptolemy, Dorotheus of Sidon, Valens, and these works.
Yes.
And then there's other people who do modern astrology, and then there's different areas of modern astrology, such as psychological astrology. But what I find is that professional astrologers sort of develop their own sort of brand.
Yes.
And they're not they don't follow necessarily an orthodox line of thinking. And I think that's healthy, because you end up with a great diversity of thought and interpretations. And it's also, people have the freedom to also professionally market their services in a way that's true to their own beliefs and their own interpretation of their charts. So I don't necessarily see astrology being recognized as a formal religion, but I think that it, in the academy, should be treated as religion. And I think you can make the case that we ought to study astrology and religious studies for the simple fact that just about every religion in Eurasia had astrology in it.
Yeah.
So if you look at the history of astrology, the Greco-Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, everybody was involved in astrology to some extent.
Yeah.
And I published a paper in the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies recently. And what I pointed out in that paper was that Buddhists have always believed in astrology. Now, that's a very simple argument to make,
Yeah.
but thus far, nobody actually pointed that out. So if you looked at encyclopedias of Buddhism until now, you would find no reference to astrology.
Oh, yeah.
But if you actually look at the Buddhist canon, if you look at the early Buddhist literature from the 1st century Common Era all the way to the later period in India, such as the 11th century, you have over 10 centuries of literature, and there's constant references to astrology. Now, it's not the sort of advanced horoscopy, such as the casting of birth charts, but there's mention of the zodiac signs, the planets, the lunar mansions, and there's also a passive belief in the tides of time as influenced particularly by the moon, which is the moon passing through the nakshatras, but also the lunar phases.
Yeah.
So in the Indian system, you have the titis, and so a titi is a lunar day. And so you have two periods, pakshas, which is the waxing and the waning of the moon. Each one is approximately 15 days. And each one of those titis or lunar days is understood as auspicious or inauspicious. And Buddhists in ancient India believed in this.
Yeah.
And then this leads to some questions too. It's like, well, how does the premises of astrological determinism work with karma? And nobody really addressed that in the Buddhist literature because it was just passive knowledge. Everybody knew that some days, some times of the day are more auspicious than other based on just the nature of time. So I pointed that out, and in some ways it's remarkable because modern Buddhist studies has been ongoing for well over a century now, and my paper was, it seems, the first one to really point this out in a very concise way.
Yeah.
And I think if we were to just say, well, why don't we have introduction to classical astrology in religious studies departments? Well, you'll probably get a lot of pushback to suggest that, because the people from the theology sides would say, well, no, we don't want to mislead our students. And then other people would say, well, that's just useless. It's divination. It's pseudoscience. It's not religion. It's some sort of an anomalous secretion that shouldn't be there. But nevertheless, historically, when you look at all of these religious traditions, people were practicing astrology, and they often had to interpret their religious ideas in light of the perceived validity of astrology. So, well, how does, for example, karma work if also the planets are affecting your destiny in this lifetime? And then you have to account for this as well in your own sort of religious, theological modes of thinking, so to speak.
Yeah, and I've already come across pushback from just what I've done already, and I've not even really begun really to you know. And I mean, my paper wasn't all about astrology; it was mainly about star worship, really. But I did do a small section where I just sort of got into the philosophical discussion of whether astrology should be considered religion, and I've already received quite a lot of pushback. There is a community, a large community of people that really don't want that to happen. Whether that is inevitable or not, I don't know. We'll have to see in the future, I suppose, and considering the work that you and your colleagues are doing as well. But I suppose one thing that really interested me was sort of astrology's relationship with Confucianism, because one aspect of Confucianism, and especially the person of Confucius as well. I don't know whether this is historically true, but seems to be this sort of saying that is associated with Confucius that he didn't see the astronomical world as important. I don't know whether you've come across this, but it's something that I sort of wanted to look into more. And I just wanted to sort of understand, and what I'll do is I'll put, for people who've not heard about this or come across this, I will put links in the description about this. But yeah, supposedly, I don't know whether this is true, but yeah, he didn't see the astronomical world as important in the sort of his Confucian sort of context, his framework of thought, his philosophy, I suppose. And sort of what I wanted to try and understand from you was sort of what what are the interactions that we know between astrology and Confucianism, and sort of, did they sort of butt heads at any point, or is that more of just kind of like a myth?
I'm not so familiar with what you're referring to
Okay.
with regard to Confucius specifically, but if we're going to talk about the state religion of China,
Yeah.
which is normally labeled as Confucianism, which is also kind of misleading because the rituals carried out traditionally by the Chinese court throughout close to 25 centuries is not necessarily strictly linked to Confucius himself.
Okay.
But the work of David Pankinier is very valuable in this respect because he points out that the early Neolithic settlements of China were aligned on a north-south axis.
Yeah.
And there seems to have been particular interest in aligning things with the north. But this was also before Polaris was the true North Star at the time as well. But because Chinese civilization is so old, and it's also so many of its records have been preserved over the centuries, we can also see the eventual sort of interest in Polaris arise. And ancient Chinese religion did view the stars, their specific constellations, as expressions of divinity. Now, they didn't necessarily have personalities like we see in Mesopotamia. So in Mesopotamia, Venus is Ishtar, and Ishtar is a goddess with a personality, preferences, and things over which she governs. But we don't see that so much in the Chinese side of things. But what we do see is the worship of heaven, earth, and also the stars. Specific stars too that were held to be divine, and there was also an interest in the Big Dipper as well, the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, and each one of those stars was assigned a divinity as well. And also based on the time you were born, you were associated also with one of those stars, and throughout your life it was in your interest also to make offerings to one of those specific stars as well. But also Polaris also had a sort of political element in it as well, because all of the stars rotate around the Polaris. If you look up at the sky, right? And so Polaris was also associated with the imperial authority, and so the harmonious sort of symbolic relationship was present throughout the literature and even the architecture at the time as well. So if you look at Chinese imperial architecture, which was also carried over to Korea, Vietnam, and Japan too, they also aligned things on a north-south axis, and aligning things with the stars was also very important as well. So really, until the collapse of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century, Chinese courts, Chinese imperial religion had a very strong interest in the stars as well. Star worship was effectively always part of court worship, and the specific times of the year were very important as well, such as the winter solstice. Winter solstice was quite significant as well. And they didn't spare expenses when they were doing these rituals too. So there were sacrifices, altars built, and then also you had deities presiding over the various directions. And in large part, I think due to the Buddhist influence, they also started portraying these deities in anthropomorphic forms as well. And
please send me resources on this particular topic, because I found it quite difficult to find sort of reliable academic sources on sort of star worship and other aspects of astronomical beliefs in Chinese society. So please send that across when you can, whenever you get the chance, because there's not really much from what I've seen online anyway at this point. I might not looked into it deeply enough yet, but yeah, please send that across. But maybe the Confucianism that I'm talking about is possibly more of a modern manifestation, that it seems to be presented as, you know, like a humanistic style religion, rationalistic, and so maybe
Confucius in the Analects, he does, and there's one famous line where he says that Confucius avoided speaking about ghosts and spirits, but he respected them. So he wasn't an atheist, but he seems to have felt that it was in your interest not to get involved in handling spirits and magic and that sort of thing.
And I think that's where the quote that I'm thinking of, or the aspect of Confucius that I'm thinking of, I believe he said something in a similar vein, but in relation to the stars. And so that's just an area that I think is quite interesting to look at.
Yeah, I'd have to, you'd probably want to look at the Analects of Confucius.
Yes.
On this, and I don't, nothing comes to mind immediately, but it's been a while since I've looked at that text. It's a very valuable text. But you know, European scholars also frame the Buddha as a rationalist as well. And they, in the late 19th century, Victorian British writers and scholars in particular were interested in making the Buddha into a rationalist. So they went to the Pali canon. That's the canon that was preserved in South Asia, such as Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, the canon of the Theravada tradition. And if you read their interpretations of Buddhism, and you also bring that into the modern day, a lot of people in the West continue to base their understanding of Buddhism on this very Eurocentric rationalist view of Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so they looked at the Buddha and they said, well, he taught a very rationalist humanistic philosophy, the Four Noble Truths, non-violence, the Eightfold Noble Path. Yes, but they also tended to ignore all of the elements such as the devas, the gods, the spirits, and all of the other supernatural beings that aided the Buddha. And the response to that has generally been to say, well, that's all later accretions. That's sort of superstitious accretions and myths that got appended to this originally pure rationalistic humanistic philosophy. But that is very misleading, I think, because first of all, we actually don't know what the Buddha said, because he lived in the 5th century and we have no contemporary sources which actually describe him or give any sort of account of what he taught. Was there even a historical Shakyamuni Buddha? That's another question too, and some scholars today actively challenge this claim that we can even understand what the Buddha said, because our earliest literature of Buddhism really only dates to around the Common Era, the early Common Era. And interestingly, a lot of our early Buddhist literature is preserved in classical Chinese translation, not in Indian languages. So that also leads to other questions of how do we interpret Buddhism?
Yeah.
So it's when you're looking at modern Western understandings of pre-modern religions, you have to be careful that you have to be cautious of the fact that a lot of these writers are coming from a very pro-rationalist, pro-materialist point of view.
Yes. One thing I was interested in asking you was, I don't know if you know much about the contemporary in China. Is astrology still, and these sort of beliefs that we're talking about, are they still really widespread? Because it's obviously data about religious beliefs are difficult to find. I mean, I've been to China myself, and I have seen some evidence that it is still widespread, but not enough to be able to, firmly say that it is. So do you know of any contemporary sources that are able to
Definitely. I know a professional Chinese astrologer who lives in Canada right now, but she's a professional Chinese astrologer and her business is booming. There's something called Ziwei, which is a form of horoscopic astrology that seems to have really evolved in the anywhere between the 13th to 16th centuries, and it's been carried on into the modern day. Of course, the Chinese state would disavow astrology, but that doesn't stop people from practicing it. You can't study astrology, obviously, in a Chinese university, as far as I know. In contrast to India, where you actually can study astrology, Jyotish, in university settings. So the Indian state doesn't disavow astrology, and it's considered a part of the Indian national heritage. But in China, it's different. But that being said, there's plenty of astrology in China. It basically has the same status in China as it would in most Western countries.
Okay, yeah, but it's still sort of its popular belief is still widespread as in Western countries. Well, if you ask someone and in the street, just a random person, maybe they would say, yeah, okay, I believe in that or some aspect of it.
I think it might even be divided along class lines again, similarly in the West as well.
Yes.
It's like it's also because people, like, there's a human tendency for your own personal beliefs to reflect your in-group identity as well,
Yes.
and whether you can openly profess that or not. So if I work for a Fortune 500 company, I'm the CEO, I can't publicly say like, oh, I'm a Virgo, therefore.
Yeah.
No, people are not going to like that. Your shareholders are not going to like that. Whereas if you're just, you know, an average working class person, you can basically speak your beliefs. And astrology nowadays, at least, is considered harmless. It's considered a harmless superstition by the mainstream.
Yeah.
But then again, defining the mainstream is also problematic too, because who gets to define the mainstream? Is the media? Is the education system the mainstream? Well, they're really not, because again, if you do a survey of the average population, what you find is that more people than not believe in ghosts and astrology, the paranormal.
Yeah.
If you ask people, do you think you had a past life? A lot of people would say, yeah, I think I do. I
Yeah.
really think I do. And if you talk, and that's also maybe why there's a lot of interest in Buddhism in the last 100 years as well, is because Buddhism teaches that that you've had many past lives, infinite past lives. And there's a lot of people who intuitively believe that they did have a past life. And some people try to define the features and circumstances of their present life based on what they experienced in a past life.
Yes.
So again, who gets to define the mainstream? I think we also have to make the distinction between prescriptive and descriptive.
Yeah.
So the prescriptive is that, well, people should not believe in past lives, therefore they don't believe in past lives, or they shouldn't. But that's not descriptive. Again, if you do a survey, what you find is that most people, despite rationalist education, they don't necessarily accept this. It's the same thing with like religious education.
Yes.
If you ask all the people who graduated from Catholic high schools, well, do you believe in the certain tenets of Catholicism? Well, you'll probably get very mixed answers, right? There's the orthodox answer, but then there's the real answer, the descriptive answer, which people would give you, because humans are very diverse and we have very different opinions and beliefs that change over time.
Yes, and can sometimes change from day to day depending on a person's mood,
Right.
what's going on in their lives as well.
But again, I don't want to sound like a Marxist, but I always try to bring this down to social classes as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Because as if you've ever experienced upward mobility, what you find is that you might come from a community where basically you can speak your mind and say what you want with regard to religious or spiritual beliefs, but then you find yourself in professional circumstances and you can't actually express your opinion openly.
Yes,
definitely. So in the past, people have asked me, they're like, well, surely you're a secularist, a materialist. I said, no, I'm not. I said, my ontology is I'm a panpsychist. I do think that all matter to varying degrees is conscious. So everything from the human brain down to the rocks and the minerals in the water is conscious, just in varying degrees. That isn't to say I think the rock has feelings or it's a self-organizing entity with its own consciousness. It's just that this awareness that we experience as sentient beings is also present in all matter. It's just in varying degrees.
Yeah.
But that's an anomalous position to take in academia. I mean, some philosophers do it, but generally, even in the humanities too, people don't say, oh, I'm a panpsychist.
No.
And a lot of people, what I find is that a lot of people, at least in the generations above me, they're reluctant to even speak on what they believe. Because there's sort of there's inhibition. Whereas you sit down with a lot of people in private, and maybe you have a drink or two with them, and they open up. It's like, yeah, I do tarot readings, and I go to a tarot card reader regularly. I definitely believe in ghosts or in gods or whatever. Like, what you find is, like in Buddhist studies, for example, there's a lot of people who are practicing Buddhist, but as far as the academy goes, they're officially neutral. But that goes back to an earlier generation where you weren't actually supposed to be a practitioner, because then the thought was that it tainted your academic work and you weren't objective enough.
Yeah, and I suppose
for some reason that doesn't extend so much to biblical studies, because you can be like an eminent biblical studies scholar but also be a Catholic nun.
Yeah.
So it's fine. But if you're a practicing Buddhist, that somehow taints your research.
Yeah. And also, I suppose as well, it's with the perceived decline of religiosity in the West, people are going to turn to other things, aren't they? And I think one aspect of Western demographics of religion that I think every scholar is eager to understand is the other. Not always the nones, but the other. Who are they? Because I know that in the UK, there's like in the last census, which was 10 years ago now, there's a 7% of other. Well, is that who we are talking about? Is that the astrology people? Is that the people with a lot more complex, who've thought about it possibly deeper than other people who are very set on what they think? So do you sort of see a correlation, sort of like an opposite correlation in a way? So traditional religiosities sort of perceived to be going downwards, so these other aspects are going upward, like astrology. Do you see some sort of...
Yeah, it's a statistical reality now that organized religion is declining. So
Yeah.
church attendance is lower and lower every year. And you see that a lot in Europe, where you have these old cathedrals that are no longer occupied by religious congregations, and then they pass the ownership over to the city.
Yeah.
And then the city might treat it as a historical monument.
Yeah.
So for example, in the Netherlands, you have these, like, there's a cathedral in downtown Amsterdam, beautiful cathedral. And I went in there and they had like a Marilyn Monroe exhibition, which I thought was remarkable. But I think it's the city that owns the building now, so they can do whatever they want with it.
Yeah.
And also in Leiden, one of the old cathedrals there, the Leiden University uses it basically as their big stadium, whatever. They need to bring in a large amount of people because it can hold a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful building too, so they should not tear these things down. But it's true that organized religion is declining. But what that means is that people can pursue their spirituality in any way they please.
Yeah.
So 50 years ago, you probably couldn't be a regular member of, for example, a Catholic congregation and openly practice astrology.
Yeah.
It probably, I mean, they wouldn't be able to necessarily stop you, but you'd probably get a lot of backlash and criticism for doing that.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's like, well, you can just do whatever you want. And with social media, you can find people outside of your immediate physical space who also will support you and work with you and support you and celebrate your achievements as well.
Yeah.
So we have in the West the decline of organized religion, but then we also have the increase and the rise of what would be the word? I don't want to say, it's maybe self-organized religion. Yeah, self-organized religion.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's very, very good. Yeah, I like that idea. And I think I've definitely experienced that with Astronism as well, with sort of movement that I'm sort of leading as well. And it exists on social media. It is spreading on social media. It's only 2013 when I started it. So it has only really ever existed at this moment on social media. So it is very much a digital movement, if you will. So I definitely get where you're coming from with that. One question I always like to ask all of my guests is sort of, what is your sort of goal in this field of study, I suppose? What is your aim to achieve in terms of studying astrology? Do you want to be able to establish some sort of consensus on perhaps what we were talking about earlier, of what astrology is, and try and sort of convince other people that it is that it should be treated as religion? Or what do you see as your goal in terms of your study of astrology then?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a scholar, and I'm also a scholar of pre-modern subjects.
Yes.
So although I pay attention to what's going on in our present times, I'm mostly interested in recovering, documenting, translating, and analyzing the past traditions of astrology. It's also just fascinating too. It's a element of transcultural history, because you have astrology passing through multiple hands, and then it ends up in East Asia. In the medieval period, and then trying to explain, well, where did all this come from? Who brought it? How? Who were the people involved? It requires a great deal of extensive research, philological research, because you have to look through a lot of primary sources. And really, I'm in uncharted territory in a lot of ways, because I'm trying to figure out who were the architects of the early tradition of astrology in medieval China. You can't just go to find a paper or a book on this, because I'm one of the few people who have ever looked at this material. And then when we go to the later centuries, like in the 16th century, well, there's these massive volumes on astrology that really nobody has looked at. It's also because to read it, you have to know classical Chinese, but to make sense of it, you already have to know astrology. So it's a very long process in order to be able to read and excavate this literature. And on top of that, you have to find a platform to publish it in too.
Yes.
So I've been able to publish my papers on astrology because I've connected it with Buddhism and Taoism.
Okay.
But if I was to submit my paper on, for example, 16th century Chinese astrology to a journal of religion, they would probably reject it, saying that's divination, not religion. So you need to connect it with a religious tradition of some sort. So there is increasing interest in the history of divination, particularly in sinology. There's a community of people who look at various forms of divination.
Yes.
Not just astrology, but also I Ching and also spirit writing and also various other forms of traditional Chinese divination, and treating it as a scientific study. So we're interested in what the tradition says about itself. And we're not asking, is it valid or invalid? We just want to know, how does the tradition itself present itself? What's the mechanics of how it works?
Yes.
And then, people can take what they want from that. So we're suspending value judgments on whether something is true or valid. And we're just interested in there's the difference between the Amic and the Etic, right?
Yes.
So the Etic would be a scientific perspective that you would be making a judgment on whether it's valid or not. And you'd be taking an external perspective on it. Whereas the Amic is what the tradition actually says about itself, and we suspend value judgments.
Brilliant. Yeah. And sort of what is the next thing for you right now in terms of your research, more generally, but also within astrology, or just you more generally, what is your next thing that you are going to be looking into that you can share with us, I suppose?
What I would like to do is publish my first book, which should be coming out in 2021-22, which will be an exhaustive study of astrology or horoscopy, specifically in China.
Brilliant.
And in Japan as well. But I also want to look at the history of astrological iconography. So I have some publications already that look at the history of all these different icons, the planets, the zodiac signs, the lunar mansions, and so forth.
Yes.
And I've already fleshed out a great deal of data and analysis just on this topic in East Asia. But there's larger questions of like, well, we can see that there are, for example, late Byzantine mosaics with the zodiac signs, and we have extant Persian examples as well.
Yes.
We also have the icons in Arabic manuscripts, and we also have the icons that change over time also in India. But nobody's actually looked at this in a very systematic, exhaustive way. And I would like eventually to do an exhaustive cataloging and analysis of all of these icons and to try to trace out the lines of transmission. So, for example, in East Asia, Virgo is often depicted as twin girls. And you would think, well, that's anomalous. Shouldn't that be Gemini? But Gemini is depicted as a man and a woman sitting together. And then the Virgo is often depicted as two young women. And it's either the Chinese actually just says the pair of women, the pair of girls.
Oh, okay.
So, but then I can't explain where that's coming from, right?
Yes. So that needs to be researched, of course, more, and that will just be extensive, won't it? It will.
That would be really exhaustive. I mean, there's manuscripts in the Vatican Library that I would actually like to look at in great detail. And also, the other exhausting point about this too is just the amount of paperwork you have to do in order to republish some of these manuscripts. So if you want to republish something from the Vatican Library, you have to get permission, and then they'll send you like a high resolution photograph. But then the permissions take time. Sometimes you have to pay money for this, and then getting everything sorted out. It's a very long process. It's not just like, oh, I'll just copy and paste this into my paper. I wish it was that simple, but you can't do that because of copyright. Even though legally speaking, you can't actually copyright like pre-modern 2D faithful images of 2D images. You can't like copyright Mona Lisa.
No, of course not. No.
But thing is that museums are aware of this, but the problem is that if you go around their backs, then it just causes problems for you later down the road if you need their cooperation with something.
It's just great as well for me to, as a very young academic, is also you know, sometimes I feel overwhelmed with what I do, and it's nice to know that other people are in the same kind of boat as well, especially with regards to this subject of sort of astronomy, religion, and the type of astrology as well, and the types of things we've discussed today. So what I'll do now is we'll come to an end of
Okay,
the
thanks very much for having me. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
It's been great, and I'd love to have you on again. I'm sure that there'll be, I've still got lots of questions, but we could be here hours, so
Sure.
I'll send it at some point. But yeah, please just send across to me any articles that you think that are relevant, sorry, to what we've discussed today, and I'll do the same as well. And let's have another conversation again some other time. So just
Definitely.
Okay, thanks Jeffrey for coming.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Just one sec.